Hey guys, welcome to DSLR Rookie. My name's Tim and today we're going to be looking at how to get started with DSLR video. We're going to really be talking about cameras and we're going to talk about why I chose the camera I did to get started. So let's go. Okay, so we want to make some video and we're going to need a camera. There's cameras everywhere nowadays. We've got cameras on our smartphones, on our tablets. You can have compact cameras, bridge cameras, mirrorless cameras, DSLRs. So what do we go for? People can make films with their phones nowadays and that's pretty amazing. But I wanted to get something a little bit better quality than on the phone. Although the image sharpness can be good, the resolution can be good, you can do really good slow motion on phones. I wanted more control, and so part of this is about taking manual control of your camera. So you need a camera that you can control the aperture, you control the ISO, you can control the shutter speed, you control the pitch profiles, things like that. That helps us get a better looking video. So basically, to make the videos I wanted to make, I wanted to get better control and I decided to go down the DSLR route. But that still left me the question with which brand to go with. People were raving about how good Panasonics are for video, people were talking about how good Sony is in low light. But I had a certain budget and I had to make a decision. So the other thing I had to think about was sensor size. The sensor is what gathers the light and what records the information on the inside of a digital camera. And on a DSLR, there are different sizes depending on your budget and which model of camera you buy. Full frame sensors are all the rage with still photography and they can do amazing things for video as well. They've got a big sensor, so it lets in loads of light and it gives you great low light capabilities and it gives you really good depth of field, really shallow depth of field for beautiful images. But I couldn't afford that. So basically I plugged for an APS-C size camera, so it's a fair bit smaller than the full frame, but it's bigger than the Micro Four Thirds that you might see in some of the Panasonics and Sonys. So, okay, should I get hung up about that? I don't think we should let this stop us at all when we're making film. And one of the reasons why is I was reading in a book, APS-C cameras, the sensor size is not that much smaller than standard 35mm film that have been used to make countless Hollywood films. So we can get decent stuff from an APS-C camera and it's affordable. So that's why I went for that. So I had to bite the bullet and there were two things that really influenced me. One was Andy Axe on YouTube. They produced a video called Filmmaking on a Budget. And that's really, really useful to get going. If you start from scratch, check it out, please do. They recommended a Canon 700D with a kit lens to get going. And the other thing was I watched quite a lot of DSLR Guide with Simon McCade and he was using a Canon 600D and he continues to use a Canon 600D. And it's amazing what he's done with that. And so I thought, okay, that's a good starting place. So I ended up buying the cheapest kit I could at that time that I could afford, and that was the Canon 750D. Why did I go for that one and not the cheaper one? I think that at the time it was the 1300D was the cheaper one. Basically the 1300D doesn't have an external microphone jack, which is really important for sound, so I wanted a camera with an external microphone jack. This has got the articulating screen. I can show you quickly here. This is my daughter's camera, it's a 650D, but the articulating screen flips out and you can turn it. You can use it if you're looking above a crowd, you can angle it down. If you're shooting low level, you can turn it up. And if you're doing vlogging like I'm doing now, you can turn it so you can see the selfie and you can see what's going on in the screen. So the articulated screen was really important for me and the external microphone jack. But it gave me the full control, manual control that I wanted, and it gave me the Canon color science. Canon colors look really good, skin tones look great, and also it gave me the access to the Canon range of lenses, which is huge, and there's loads of choice and there's loads of price points. So those were really important things for me. The autofocus is pretty good, although this isn't as good as something like the Canon 80D, but basically this was the best camera I could afford at the time. So before I bought my own gear, I did a little bit of video with work and I didn't really know what I was doing, but we had a Nikon D3200, which is fine, it's a reasonable camera, and basically I shot that using auto mode, so I didn't really have control, and I didn't really understand why some of the colours was too saturated, or the lighting looked bad, or when the camera moved or there was fluorescent flicker, things like that. I was having problems, and the reason why I was having some of those problems is because I didn't have a clue, and it was just in auto mode. Now that's not a Nikon issue, that's any camera we stick in auto mode, it's not going to get the best results for video. How do you get going? How do you set up a camera for getting good video? So one of the important things is frames per second. When your camera's rolling video, it's snapping off lots of still shots, and then those are played back in sequence, and that's how you get your film. But basically you have a choice of how many of those shots it takes each second. Now for cinema, the standard for that is 24 frames per second. For UK TV, and I think in Europe too, it's 25 frames per second. And in the US, I believe for the TV stuff, it's 30 frames per second. So we sometimes use these different speeds, although if we're uploading to YouTube, it doesn't really matter. You can use 24, 25, 30, and people can see that all over the world, so that's not an issue. So the second thing to talk about is the shutter speed. And the basic rule of thumb is you want to try and get your shutter speed to be double your frames per second. Basically the shutter speed is a fraction of a second, so 1/50th, I take the bottom number. If I'm shooting 25 frames per second, I want 50 on my shutter speed, it's 1/50th. And if I'm shooting 30 frames per second, then I need my shutter speed to be 60, 1/60th. So the next thing I think about is the colour profiles in the camera, the picture profiles. They might be called slightly different things in different brands, but when I used it in auto on the Nikon, I just ended up with super saturated colours, and I couldn't really control them, and I found them really hard to adjust afterwards. And so I wanted something that's fairly neutral, fairly flat, and I think the starting point, we'll talk about this maybe in another session, but the main starting point is put it in a neutral profile. Canon has a neutral profile on there. I don't know what the Nikon one is called, but you want something that isn't super saturated, that has low contrast, has low saturation, has low sharpness, and that basically helps you when you're editing later to change the colours. If you're not going to edit the colours afterwards, then you might want to think about that. But I don't want to get bogged down that into this today. So the way I set it up is with a neutral profile. The other things, ISO, that's how sensitive your sensor is. Basically you want that to be the lowest number you can. I'm shooting right now at 100 ISO because we've got some nice daylight coming through the window, but if it's darker, then I might need to increase that ISO to 200, 400, 800. I don't really want to shoot a lot higher than that, because what happens is you get this kind of noise, you get this graininess to your pictures, you get some like little pixels at the wrong colour coming out. So you want the ISO to be as low as you can. And the other rule of thumb then for aperture, if I want to get a slightly blurred out background rather than it being sharp, part of that is me moving close to the camera and leaving the background further away, but part of that is using a big aperture. Now this is the maybe confusing bit, that the bigger the aperture is, the smaller the aperture number is. So I've got a lens here that can shoot at f2, that's a big aperture, and so that allows me to get a blurrier background. I want to use that for the stuff I'm doing most of the time. And that was my rule of thumb when I got started, was open your aperture up, you get a lovely blurry background, and things look a little bit more cinematic. Now that is like way too simple, and there's more complications to this, but that's just was my starting point. We'll talk about aperture, ISO and things like that in another episode, but basically that was my setup for my camera. I wanted to use a decent size aperture, as big as I could in the circumstances. I wanted to use a low ISO, I wanted to have a fairly neutral picture profile, and I wanted to get my frames per second and my shutter speed double my frames per second. So I was using 25 frames per second and 1/50th for my shutter speed, and that gave me reasonable results so long as the light wasn't too light or too dark. We'll talk about light and how to deal with that another time, but that was how I set my camera up. So that's about it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's been useful. If it is, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content. Basically, this channel is all about trying to get the best video quality we can out of our gear, and I'm using pretty basic stuff, quite affordable stuff. It gets expensive really quick. But I want to help people follow my journey and share with others as we try and overcome those obstacles and try and get the best footage we can from DSLR. This is DSLR Rookie, and see you next time.